Number 1. Greek fire and the Kallinikos formula. You are standing on a Byzantine warship in the Sea of Marmara in 678. The Arab fleet surrounding you has more ships, more men, and complete confidence that you cannot escape. Then the siphon mounted on your bow fires. The Arab ships do not retreat. They burn where they sit, because Greek fire cannot be extinguished with water, and the Arab sailors trying to drown the flames are feeding them. The formula was held by a single family, the Kallinikos lineage, under imperial patent. Byzantine sailors first deployed it in 672 off the coast of Cyzicus. The same Arab fleet had been blockading Constantinople for 5 years. In 655, Arab engineers captured Byzantine fireships intact at the Battle of the Masts. They had the hardware, the residue, and the most technically sophisticated chemists in the world. They could not replicate it. Leo the mathematician, writing in the 9th century, described the formula as the great secret of the Roman state. It was kept from all foreigners on pain of anathema. The last confirmed use of Greek fire in battle is 1118. After 1204, it is not mentioned in any source. What nobody has ever explained is why the most effective naval weapon in the known world simply stopped being used. The most reasonable explanation is that the formula was lost in the chaos of the Fourth Crusade. Constantinople was sacked by Latin forces in 1204. The Kallinikos family almost certainly dispersed. Knowledge held by a single lineage was always one generation away from extinction. But Arab engineers had captured intact Greek fire apparatus in 655. They spent 450 years failing to reverse engineer it. They had everything except the knowledge, which means the formula was not simply chemistry. It was a manufacturing tradition. It had to be learned from someone who had already done it. The last person who had done it died in 1204 or shortly after. He passed nothing on or was prevented from doing so. Every proposed reconstruction has failed to produce the described effects. The silence after 1204 is total. That loss was one family's secret dying with them. The next was an entire civilization's workshop destroyed in a single afternoon. Number 2. Al-Jazari's workshop and the Mongol sack. The book of knowledge of ingenious mechanical devices survived. The machines it describes did not. It sits in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul as MS Ayasofya 36-6. Al-Jazari completed it in 1206 for the Artukid Sultan of Diyarbakir. It describes 50 mechanical devices, including programmable water clocks, automated serving machines, and a musical automaton driven by a rotating drum with repositionable pegs. These were not diagrams for future construction. They were records of machines that had been built, demonstrated, and operated. In 1258, Hulagu Khan's forces took Baghdad. The House of Wisdom, the intellectual center of the Islamic world for 5 centuries, was destroyed. The chronicler Ibn al-Athir wrote that the Tigris ran black with ink from the manuscripts thrown into it. The workshops that had sustained the tradition Al-Jazari drew from were gone in days. No Baghdad workshop after 1258 produced anything of comparable mechanical complexity, ever. The machines Al-Jazari described were not theoretical. They were built and demonstrated, and then the people who built them were gone. The Mongols were documented patrons of science and technology in other conquered territories. The Book of Knowledge itself survived, which means the destruction was not systematic enough to eliminate manuscripts entirely. Knowledge traditions have survived military conquest before and after 1258. The book survived in a single copy carried out before the sack. The craftsmen who could execute the tolerances it required did not. Modern engineers who have attempted to build the devices from the manuscript report the same problem. The diagrams assume fabrication knowledge that is nowhere in the text. The gap between a technical manuscript and a functioning workshop is precisely what was destroyed in 1258. That gap has never been closed. Al-Jazari's machines were destroyed because the city that built them was destroyed. The next loss was more deliberate, an institution eliminating the infrastructure that threatened it. Number 3. The Toledan Translation Network. For 150 years, the city of Toledo was the single most important site of knowledge transfer in the Western world, and then it was not. Archbishop Raimundo established the translation school in Toledo around 1130. A Lombard scholar named Gerard of Cremona arrived in 1144, looking for Ptolemy's Almagest. He found it, translated it, and did not leave for 40 years. His translation list survives. 87 major works from Arabic into Latin, including Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, Euclid's Elements, and 17 works by Aristotle that Europe had not seen for centuries. The Almohad invasion of Andalusia beginning in 1147 destroyed the library infrastructure in Cordoba and Seville. That infrastructure had supplied Toledo's translators with source material. After Gerard's death in 1187, output declined steadily. By 1250, it had effectively stopped. The question is not what Toledo translated, that record survives. The question is what was in the Cordoban libraries that never made it north before the Almohads burned them. The Almohads were religiously motivated, not specifically targeting philosophical knowledge. Some private libraries survived and were dispersed rather than destroyed. The argument that what mattered had already been transmitted to Toledo is not unreasonable. But Girard's own annotations reference source texts he could not obtain. The library of the Caliph al-Hakam II in Cordoba was described by contemporary sources as holding 400,000 volumes. What arrived in Toledo before 1147 was, by any reasonable estimate, a fraction of what existed. What was not translated before 1147 was not preserved anywhere north of the Almohad advance. The translations that survived transformed European medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. What did not survive cannot be inventoried. The catalogue of what was lost is blank by definition, which is the most complete erasure of all. The Toledan network was destroyed because its sources were destroyed. The next story is different. The knowledge survived. The man who held it was imprisoned, and when he died, the knowledge died with him. Number 4. Roger Bacon's optical manuscripts. In 1267, Roger Bacon sent a letter to Pope Clement IV describing instruments that would not be invented for another 300 years. The letter accompanied the Opus Majus, a work Clement had personally commissioned. Bacon was a Franciscan friar at Oxford. The Opus Majus described a compound lens arrangement that produced magnification, prefiguring the telescope by 3 centuries. Clement IV died before reading it. Jerome of Ascoli, the Minister General of the Franciscan Order, condemned Bacon's work around 1277 for suspected novelties. He placed Bacon under supervision in the Paris friary. Bacon remained under Franciscan custody for roughly 14 years. His manuscripts were reportedly chained to shelves in the Oxford Franciscan Library to prevent unauthorized copying. Roger of Wendover's Chronicle contains a notation confirming the chaining of Bacon's optical manuscripts specifically. The general version of the Opus Majus circulated and survives. The detailed instrument specifications Bacon described to Clement IV do not appear in any surviving manuscript. Bacon's offense was not heresy. It was describing instruments nobody was supposed to be able to build yet. The Franciscan order had legitimate doctrinal concerns about Bacon's methods. His natural philosophy was entangled with claims about secret sciences the order considered dangerous. The imprisonment was disciplinary, not specifically targeted at his optics work. His manuscripts were never formally burned. But Jerome of Ascoli became Pope Nicholas IV in 1288. The Oxford Franciscan Library Catalogue from the same year shows a gap precisely where Bacon's optical apparatus manuscripts should appear. The detailed specifications, the material most dangerous to the theological model of how the physical world worked, are absent. What circulated after 1288 is the version without them. Whether the specifications were deliberately removed or lost in a damaged exemplar is genuinely contested. What is not contested is that the most specific part of what Bacon sent to Clement IV is gone. Bacon's knowledge was held by one man and died in institutional custody. The next was held by thousands of craftsmen across a continent and still disappeared. Number 5. Damascus steel and the Wootz tradition. In 1973, a metallurgist named Cyril Stanley Smith put a Damascus steel sword blade under an electron microscope and found something that should not have been there. The carbide banding in the blade was arranged in a pattern no medieval forge process should have been capable of producing. Smith published his findings. No modern metallurgist has replicated the underlying structure through any intentional process. Damascus steel was produced from Wootz ingots imported from workshops in southern India. The production tradition operated continuously from roughly 900 to the mid-1700s. The technique was held by a small number of smithing families in the Levant and Persia. In 2006, Peter Palfler's team at the Technical University of Dresden examined a 17th-century Damascus blade. They found carbon nanotubes and cementite nanowires in the steel matrix. These nanostructures require conditions that modern material science cannot reproduce intentionally. Analysis of Wootz ore from the Golconda region showed specific trace elements, vanadium and chromium, that appear to have influenced the crystalline structure during forging in ways still not fully understood. The question is not whether Damascus steel was extraordinary, it demonstrably was. The question is how craftsmen with medieval forge equipment produced a nanostructure that modern materials science cannot deliberately replicate. The most credible explanation is that the technique was lost gradually as the Wootz trade declined. Oral craft traditions degrade naturally without continuous practice. The exhaustion of the Golconda ore deposits, with their specific trace element profile, is the primary material explanation. When that ore ran out, the tradition became unreproducible. The smithing families were still operating in the 1700s. European buyers were actively seeking blades. The demand had not collapsed. What stopped was not the knowledge of the forge process. It was the supply of the specific ore that made the process produce those results. When the ore ran out, the knowledge became a skill with nothing left to practice on. Modern attempts to replicate Damascus steel have produced visually similar surface patterns. None have produced the underlying nanostructure. What was lost was not a formula. It was a material conversation between a craft tradition and a raw material that no longer exists. Damascus steel was lost because the raw material that made it possible was exhausted. The next was lost because the organization that held it was deliberately destroyed. Number 6. The Templar Letter of Credit System. You are a pilgrim leaving Paris for Jerusalem in 1280. Instead of carrying gold that can be stolen, you carry a document. It is a letter of credit issued by the temple, encoded in a cipher only temple preceptories can read. When you arrive at a preceptory in Acre, they verify the cipher, check the issuing house's notation, and pay you in local currency. The gold never traveled, only information did. The temple network operated preceptories from England to the Holy Land. The letter of credit system required a matching cipher between issuing and redeeming houses. That infrastructure operated across 12 languages and 3 continents. On the 13th of October, 1307, an arrest order signed by Philip IV was delivered before dawn. It arrived simultaneously at every Templar preceptory in France. Every Grand Master, Knight, and Administrator was taken the same morning. Philip IV owed the Paris Temple an amount contemporary chronicles estimate as several years of French royal revenue. The proceedings of the Paris trials survive as MS Latin 10919 in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. What does not survive is any cipher key, any letter of credit template, or any record of the encoding system. 200 years of Templar financial operation left no administrative trace. Philip IV burned the temple treasury records before the trials began, which raises the question of what those records contain beyond the cipher system. The stated basis for the arrests was heresy and sodomy. The financial records were lost in the general chaos of a coordinated mass arrest. The Hospitallers absorbed most of the Templar property and infrastructure, which suggests continuity rather than deliberate erasure. But the Hospitaller absorption was selective. They took land, buildings, and movable property. They did not acquire the administrative methodology. The Paris Temple's financial records were in Philip's personal custody from the morning of October 13th. They were never produced at the trials. Jacques de Molay was burned at the stake in 1314, without any financial accounting being presented to any court. The debt and the cipher disappeared in the same week. The letter of credit system did not reappear in European banking until Italian merchant families reinvented it more than a century later. Whether Philip burned the records to conceal what he owed, or whether they simply did not survive the arrests, is an open question. No surviving document answers it. Both the cipher and the evidence of the debt are gone. They became gone at exactly the same moment. The Templars' financial system was destroyed by a king who owed it money. The next was destroyed by an institution that feared what it proved. Number 7. Guy de Chauliac and the Evian Medical Archive. Guy de Chauliac was the most accomplished surgeon in medieval Europe. He survived the Black Death by his own clinical account. The archive he compiled at Avignon was never seen after 1377. The Chirurgia Magna, completed in 1363, survives in dozens of manuscript copies. It influenced European surgical practice for 2 centuries. In it, Chauliac describes isolating himself for 6 weeks during the plague of 1348 and treating himself clinically throughout. It is the first documented medical quarantine protocol, attributed to a named physician. Chauliac was appointed papal physician at Avignon around 1342. Avignon had more documented plague deaths than any other European city in the 1340s. Chauliac was there, treating patients for all of it. The Chirurgia Magna describes plague symptoms with a clinical specificity not found in any other surviving medieval medical text. When Pope Gregory XI ended the Avignon papacy and returned to Rome in 1377, the papal archive was packed, transported, and catalogued on arrival. The transfer catalogue exists. It is detailed. Chauliac's supplementary clinical records are absent from it. These were case files accumulated over 30 years of practice at the epicenter of the worst disease event in European history. Chauliac was meticulous. The Chirurgia Magna contains more than 3,000 internal cross-references. That makes the absence of his case files from a detailed transfer catalog harder to explain away. Documents were routinely lost in major institutional relocations. The Church had theological reasons to control medical information that contradicted its explanations of the plague as divine punishment. The loss may have been administrative. Case files are not formal correspondence and might have been considered below the threshold for cataloging. But the catalog that survives is not selective about minor documents. It lists routine administrative correspondence in detail. Chauliac's 30 years of case files would have been among the most substantial items in the collection. Their absence from a catalog that recorded far less significant things is not accidental omission. The Chirurgia Magna influenced surgery for 2 centuries. What was in the case files from the worst plague years is unknown. Chauliac's files disappeared in a cataloged transfer, which means someone decided they should not arrive. The next loss was less deliberate and more total. Number 8. The Byzantine cloisonné glass formula. There are roughly 1,000 surviving Byzantine cloisonné enamel objects in the world, and modern conservators cannot reproduce the base glass used to make any of them. Spectral analysis of the finest Byzantine pieces shows a glass matrix with a colorant distribution unlike anything in the surviving technical literature. The color has a depth and internal refraction that contemporary conservators have described as technically inexplicable, not unusual, inexplicable. Byzantine cloisonné reached its technical peak in the 10th and 11th centuries under the Macedonian emperors. The Pala d'Oro in the Basilica di San Marco in Venice contains Byzantine enamel panels looted in 1204. They are still there, visible to anyone who visits. Venetian craftsmen trained by Byzantine refugees began producing cloisonné from 1204 onward. The Venetian pieces are beautiful. They are also spectrally distinct from pre-1204 Byzantine work across hundreds of examined objects. The Constantinople workshops that produced the high Byzantine enamel were destroyed in the 1204 sack and never re-established. What the Byzantine craftsmen knew about their glass flux that the refugees did not pass on is the question the objects themselves cannot answer. Craft knowledge degrades naturally when workshops are broken up and craftsmen dispersed. Refugees carry what they remember, not what they never thought to write down. The spectral difference between Byzantine and Venetian work might reflect raw material variation rather than a withheld formula, but the spectral difference is consistent across hundreds of objects spanning a full century of Byzantine production. It is not batch variation. It tracks the pre-1204 and post-1204 divide with near-perfect consistency. The pattern holds across different workshops, different decades, and different parts of the empire. What changed in 1204 was not the materials available in Venice. It was who was doing the mixing. The objects survive. You can stand in front of the Pala d'Oro and look at what was made before 1204. The glass has a quality that professional conservators cannot account for with any formula currently known. The cloisonné secret died because the people who held it were scattered. The next was not scattered. It was administratively expelled, and the tools stayed behind. Number 9. The Toledo Astrolabe Network. The production records from Toledo's astrolabe workshops between 1085 and 1250 show a coordinated network of at least 40 named craftsmen working from shared templates, and then the records stop, and the network stops with them. The workshops operated under the influence of a mathematician named Ibrahim Al-Zarqali, known in the Latin sources as Azarkiel. His Toledan tables, produced around 1075, were the most accurate astronomical tables in Europe for over a century. Surviving Toledo astrolabes show engraving tolerances that imply calibration tools not documented anywhere in the surviving technical record. In the 1270s, Alfonso X of Castile gathered what could be recovered into the Libros del Saber de Astronomia. It was a real attempt to preserve what was still accessible, but the Muslim craftsmen who maintained the practical workshop tradition had faced increasing legal restrictions since the Castilian consolidation. The last documented Toledo astrolabe from a named Muslim craftsman is dated 1231. After the formal expulsions, European craftsmen who continued the tradition produced instruments measurably less precise for 2 full generations. The craftsmen were not killed, they were expelled, which means the knowledge left Toledo intact, and what was lost was the institutional infrastructure that had supported precision production. The expelled craftsmen relocated to Andalusia and North Africa and continued working. The Libros del Saber demonstrates that theoretical knowledge was preserved. The loss was gradual attrition, not a single moment of destruction. Precision instrument production requires calibration tools specific to a workshop. Those tools tools cannot be reconstructed from a description of the instruments they produce. Craftsmen in new locations without those tools produced instruments correct in theory and imprecise in execution. The Libros del Saber preserves the geometry. It does not preserve the tooling. Theory without tooling produces correct diagrams and instruments that drift. This is the pattern across this entire list. Knowledge survives in text. Practical capability does not. The gap between a technical manuscript and a functioning workshop is always the thing that gets destroyed. By conquest, by arrest, by expulsion, or by the death of the last person who had done it with their hands. Toledo is the clearest case where that destruction can be dated to a specific administrative decision by a specific king. The Toledo network was destroyed by a policy decision, not a military one. The last item was destroyed by something that had no author. Number 10. Villers d'Harnoncourt and the Master Builder Tradition. In 1858, a French archivist named Jean-Baptiste Antoine Lassus opened a portfolio at the Bibliothèque Nationale. The man who drew it had understood things that modern structural engineers still cannot fully explain. The portfolio is MS FAR 19093. It exists. You can request it. Villers d'Harnoncourt drew it around 1225 to 1240. It contains structural diagrams, geometric construction methods for Gothic vaulting, observations on cathedrals across France and Hungary, and a perpetual motion design. It is not a textbook. It is a working notebook, the kind a master builder carries, which means it contains what Villard considered worth recording, not what he considered obvious. The structural geometry describes load distribution methods for ribbed vaulting that modern structural analysis confirms are correct. The derivation, the reasoning behind why the proportions work, is not explained anywhere in the drawings. Chartres, Rams, and Amiens were built using methods from this tradition. They have stood for 800 years. Between 1347 and 1353, the plague killed approximately half the skilled building workforce in Europe. The great Gothic cathedral campaigns that define the High Period all ended before 1347. After the plague, no European structure of comparable structural ambition was attempted for a century. Villard's portfolio is a fragment of a tradition. He drew what he considered worth recording, which means everything he considered obvious he did not write down. The Gothic building tradition was transmitted through apprenticeship. Masters who survived the plague continued teaching. Construction continued and produced genuine achievements. The tradition evolved rather than ended. But the post-plague Gothic record shows measurable changes in structural ambition. The campaigns that produced the highest Gothic vaults all predate 1347. What was attempted after was not the same scale. The knowledge Villard considered too obvious to write down was held by the generation that died in the plague years. The generation after did not attempt what the generation before had attempted, which suggests they knew they were missing something they could not name. MS FAR 19093 sits in Paris. What it describes that Villard did not explain is still not fully understood. 800 years of standing cathedrals are the proof of concept for a method nobody has ever been able to write down completely. What runs through all 10 of these losses is not catastrophe. It is proximity. The distance between knowledge and the people who carried it was always smaller than anyone realized until it was too late. A single family, a single city, a single generation, a single archive transfer. The medieval world built things we cannot build and understood things we cannot explain. The distance between that world and ours is not the centuries. It is the specific moments when the last person who knew something did not pass it on. If these are the stories you want more of, subscribe, because the medieval period alone has enough of them to last years.